Pull your chair a little closer. Dim the lights. Can you hear it? That low, persistent hum just beyond the edge of your hearing. That's the sound of a story wanting to be told. A story that crawls out of the black, silty mud of the Mississippi Delta. A tale steeped in fear, vengeance, and a fire that burned so hot it was said to have scorched the very gates of hell. Tonight, we're not just telling a ghost story. We are unearthing a curse. One pronounced by a dying woman as the quicksand swallowed her whole. A promise of fiery retribution that, 20 years later, came true with an almost biblical fury. This is the story of Yazoo City and the witch who burned it to the ground from beyond the grave. Our tale begins where all things in the Delta begin, with the river. The Yazoo, a name whispered by the Choctaw long before the first white man ever set his polished boot upon its muddy banks. It is a slow, deceptive river, the color of coffee and secrets, winding through the cypress swamps like a great serpent. In the 1820s, this land was a fever dream of opportunity. The air was so thick with humidity you could drink it, and the mosquitoes rose in humming clouds that could blot out the setting sun. This was a place of brutal, primal beauty, where fortunes and cotton could be grown from the impossibly fertile soil, and where life could be snuffed out just as quickly by the unseen plagues that festered in the stagnant water. Into this world stepped 5 men, their hearts full of ambition and their pockets full of deeds. They had purchased a vast tract of land from the Choctaw chief Greenwood Leffler, a man who walked in both the world of his people and the world of the encroaching settlers. They envisioned a great port town, a jewel of commerce in the wilderness. They called it Manchester. With surveying lines and maps, they tried to tame the chaos, carving out streets and naming them for Jefferson and Monroe, imposing a grid of order upon a land that had never known it. And the people came, by steamboat, by horse, by foot. They came for the promise of white gold cotton. The town of Manchester, soon renamed Yazoo City in deference to the river that was its lifeblood, began to sprout from the mud. Houses, stores, banks, and 2 grand hotels with verandas overlooking the water. By 1840, it was a thriving hub, shipping 25,000 bales of cotton a year downriver. A courthouse was built, its proud columns a testament to law and progress in the untamed Delta. Yazoo City was a success story, a monument to the indomitable spirit of man. But man is not the only spirit that dwells in these lands. To the west and south of the city, the world dissolved into the swamp, a place where the cypress trees, ancient and bearded with moss, stood like skeletal sentinels in the black water. A place that smelled of sweet decay, of life and death locked in a perpetual, humid embrace. And in that half-drowned world, legends thrived like the fungus on a rotting log. It was from the shadowed heart of this swamp that she came. No one knew her name or her origin. She was simply there, as if the swamp itself had birthed her. Her cabin was a hovel of driftwood and scavenged planks. Hidden deep within the cypress maze, the townspeople, so proud of their new courthouse and their growing fortunes, had little time for a hermit who lived on the fringes. They saw her bent figure moving through the fog at dusk, gathering herbs, and they were unsettled. They whispered that her voice was a low mutter that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, that her cats watched from the branches of trees with an unnerving human intelligence. Before she ever uttered a curse, before she was ever accused of a crime, they had already named her. She was the witch. Fear needs a place to take root, and in the early days of Yazoo, grief provided the fertile soil. Yellow fever, carried on the wings of the ever-present mosquitoes, swept through the raw settlement like a phantom menace. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of days. In their terror and sorrow, the people needed someone to blame, and their eyes turned to the swamp. Some claimed the old woman had brought the fever upon them as revenge for being shunned. Others whispered she had tried to warn them, but they had refused to listen to her strange, swamp-born wisdom. The truth didn't matter. The seed of fear had been planted. When the fever finally receded, the name remained. The Witch of Yazoo. Life in the town returned to its rhythm of commerce and cotton. But the shadow of the witch now lingered permanently at its edges. Children would dare each other to creep to the edge of the swamp and whisper her name, returning with wide-eyed tales of seeing jars filled with bones and animal skulls on her porch. The adults would laugh, a little too loudly, before locking their doors a little more securely at night. She was an absence that had more presence than most people, the dark shape you glimpsed at the edge of your vision. Then, the stories began to change. They grew teeth. It started with the fishermen. These were hardy men who knew the river's every mood and trick. But they began to vanish. A storm would blow in, a sudden, violent squall that turned the brown water into a black, churning nightmare. And a boat would be found days later, drifting empty, its nets still hanging from the side, a lantern cold and unlit. At first, it was tragedy. The river was a fickle mistress. It gave and it took away. But then a second fisherman disappeared, and a third. The whispers in the taverns and on the street corners grew louder, more certain. It was her, the witch. The stories became chillingly specific. They said she would light a lantern on the riverbank during a storm, a single point of light promising shelter. She would call out to the lost fishermen, her voice carrying over the wind, beckoning them into her cabin. And once they were inside, she would offer them a bowl of hot stew, a kindness that masked a deadly intent. The stew, they said, was laced with poison hemlock that grew wild in the swamp. She would watch, her eyes gleaming in the firelight, as the men choked and convulsed, their lives ending on the dirt floor of her hovel. Then, they said, she would drag their bodies out into the swamp and bury them deep beneath the cypress roots, where no one would ever find them. The terror in Yazoo City became a palpable thing. It hung in the air with the humidity, a constant, oppressive weight. Mothers forbade their children from going anywhere near the swamp. Men began to fish in groups, their eyes constantly scanning the dark tree line. The town's prosperity felt like a mockery in the face of this primal fear. Their courthouse and their laws seemed powerless against a force that lived in the shadows and dealt in death. The preacher's sermons grew more fervent, his voice thundering from the pulpit, about the devil's snares and the evil that walks in darkness. But everyone knew he wasn't talking about some abstract demon. He was talking about the woman in the swamp. The breaking point came late one autumn. A young traveler, a boy from Vicksburg, stumbled into town, his face pale with terror, his clothes torn and muddy. He told a frantic story at the tavern, his voice trembling as the men gathered around him. He had been lost, traveling along the river as night fell. The mist so thick he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. Then he saw a light, a faint glow through the trees. Thinking it was a friendly campfire, he made his way towards it. As he drew closer, he heard a sound, a low, guttural chanting, a voice that was not quite human, weaving a tune without words. He peered through the dense foliage and saw her. A bent figure, her long gray hair unbound and snaking around her face, her hands moving in slow, deliberate circles over a cauldron that bubbled with a thick, black substance. The traveler didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran. The sound of that inhuman chanting chasing him through the darkness, his story was the spark that lit the fuse. The town's simmering fear exploded into a righteous fury. This was no longer a ghost story. This was a monster at their doorstep. The sheriff, a man named T.L. Starling, knew he could no longer contain the town's rage. He deputized a posse of the town's strongest men. They gathered in the pre-dawn gloom, their faces grim, their hands clutching rifles and torches. They were going into the swamp. They were going to end this. They moved through the cypress knees in black water, the mud sucking at their boots. The swamp seemed to resist them, its gnarled branches grabbing at their clothes, its strange noises echoing around them, mocking their intrusion. They followed the faint trail to her cabin, their hearts pounding in their chests. They burst through the flimsy door, ready for a confrontation, but the hovel was empty. A small fire smoldered in the hearth, and the air was thick with the smell of strange herbs, but she was gone. Then they heard a cry, a shriek of rage and defiance from deeper within the swamp. She knew they were coming. The hunt began. They chased her through the half-drowned wilderness. A frantic, desperate pursuit. She was preternaturally swift, flitting through the trees like a phantom, her gray hair a fleeting banner in the gloom. They cornered her at last. On a small patch of solid ground surrounded on all sides by a bubbling, treacherous mire of quicksand, there was nowhere left for her to run. She faced them, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure and so intense, it made the armed men recoil. She was no longer a frail old woman. She was a vessel of pure malice. As the sheriff and his men began to close in, she took a step backward, and then another, her bare feet sinking into the greedy, grasping mud of the quicksand. She did not scream for help. She did not beg for her life. As the mire pulled her down, slowly, inexorably, she raised a skeletal hand and pointed a trembling finger at the townspeople. And then she spoke the words that would seal Yazoo City's fate. Her voice, no longer a mutter, rose into a terrifying shriek that echoed through the swamp. In 20 years, she screamed, her eyes locking onto theirs, I will return, and I will burn this town to the ground. The quicksand swallowed her, her final, chilling laughter bubbling up from the mud before she was gone completely. The men stood in stunned silence, the witch's curse hanging in the heavy air. They returned to the town, shaken but triumphant. The evil was gone. To make sure her spirit could never escape, the townspeople buried her body what they could, recover of the newly established Glenwood Cemetery. But this was no ordinary burial. They placed her in a grave at the very center of the cemetery and encircled it with the thickest, heaviest iron chains they could forge. They were not just burying a body. They were imprisoning a soul. For 20 years, life went on. The memory of the witch and her curse faded, becoming just another piece of local folklore, a scary story to tell the children. Yazoo City entered its golden age. New buildings were constructed. The cotton trade flourished, and the future seemed limitless. The curse was forgotten. But the witch had not forgotten. The morning of May 25, 1904, dawned bright and clear. It was exactly 20 years to the day since the witch had been swallowed by the quicksand. The day began like any other, but just after noon. A small fire broke out in the parlor of a home on Main Street. A tragic accident, nothing more. The fire bell began to toll. But then, something unnatural happened. A wind began to blow. It was not a normal wind. Witnesses later described it as a living thing, a hot, furious gale that seemed to scream as it tore through the streets. It came from all directions at once, whipping the small fire into an uncontrollable inferno. The flames leaped from rooftop to rooftop with an unholy speed, devouring the wooden buildings as if they were made of paper. The fire seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, twisting and turning, seeking out the town's most cherished landmarks. The new courthouse, the opera house, the banks. The homes all were consumed by the roaring orange tide. The heat was so intense it melted glass and buckled steel. For hours, the city burned. When the wind finally died down and the smoke began to clear, Yazoo City was gone. 324 buildings, the heart of the entire city, were reduced to a smoldering, blackened ruin. It was a scene of utter devastation, an apocalyptic landscape of ash and rubble. In the stunned, grief-stricken aftermath, a thought, cold and terrifying, crept into the minds of the survivors. The curse. A small group of them made their way through the ruins to the Glenwood Cemetery, a place of dreadful pilgrimage. They approached the witch's grave, their hearts hammering against their ribs. And then they saw it. The massive, heavy iron links of the chains that had been wrapped around her grave for 2 decades, were not just broken. They were snapped clean through, as if by some incredible, explosive force. The witch had kept her promise. She had returned. The story doesn't end there. The people of Yazoo City, resilient and brave, rebuilt their town from the ashes. But the legend of the witch is now woven into the very fabric of the place. They say the chains on her grave in Glenwood Cemetery have been replaced many times over the years, but they are always found broken again. Locals will tell you that on dark, moonless nights, a shadowy figure can sometimes be seen moving among the tombstones, and the faint sound of laughter can be heard on the wind. The Witch of Yazoo City became more than just a local legend. She became a chilling, undeniable part of its history. A terrifying reminder that some promises are never broken, and that hatred can burn hotter and longer than any fire. So, what do you believe? Was it a freak fire, fanned by a coincidental wind? Or was it the fiery vengeance of a wronged woman, reaching out from beyond the grave to fulfill a terrible curse? The next time you hear an old story, a local legend dismissed as folklore, maybe listen a little closer, because some stories aren't just stories. They are warnings. Thank you for joining me in the shadows tonight. If this tale chilled you to the bone, let me know in the comments below. And if you have a local legend, a hometown horror story that you think the world needs to hear, share it. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the dark. Until then, try to sleep well and listen for the whispers in the wind.